I'm Mark Pimenta, the host of the Warlords of History podcast, focused on intriguing warriors and leaders, ancient and medieval, that were titans during their respective ages, where, over several episodes, we'll review each of their lifetimes and actions, but also take this further by exploring the surrounding environmental and political conditions, their motivations for taking on the mantle of war. We'll cover what they did, how they did it, and finally, what their legacy was beyond their demise. If any of this interests you, join me as we dive into each of their lifetimes, their worlds, in the Warlords of History podcast.
This episode is sponsored by Masterclass. Though it is really important to know stuff, Masterclass's world-famous instructors show you how to do what's important to you. When I set out to prepare for this podcast almost exactly 1 year ago, I knew in April 2020 that I needed to get better at writing. That's where one of my favorite authors, Malcolm Gladwell, came in. Masterclass makes it possible for me and others wanting to improve their writing to take a class from Malcolm Gladwell on writing at our own pace. You can watch, and in many cases listen to awesome instructors like Malcolm Gladwell teach you how to do what's important to you. You want to be a better cook? Gordon Ramsay teaches you how on the Masterclass platform. You want to learn how to act? Natalie Portman teaches you on the Masterclass platform. Grow yourself and support Forgotten Wars by trying Masterclass for the year using the link in our show notes. Learn how to do what's important to you from the experts. Now, to our episode.
This is Forgotten Wars.
Deneys Reitz rode with General Jan Smuts and his band of guerrillas into the Cape Colony, hoping against all odds that this time would be different, that this time they could ignite an Afrikaner uprising in the Cape Colony. But how were they to deal with the many blockhouses before them? Blockhouse 4 bothered Smuts. Some of his warriors attacked it before, but without success. Smuts wouldn't leave this blockhouse alone, even though he didn't have to defeat it. So Smuts ordered Commandant Maurits to take the blockhouse. The young Deneys Reitz saw Maurits as, quote, a short, dark man of enormous physical strength, cruel and ruthless in his methods, but a splendid guerrilla leader, and according to his lights, an ardent patriot. Deneys Reitz sets the remarkable scene that followed. Quote, with Maurits went the Marquis de Thiers-Suzanne, a young French adventurer who had been his constant associate since the war began. I went too, and, as before, we were challenged, but reached the ledge in safety. The first thing Maurits did was to stand on another man's shoulders in order to calculate the throwing distance. He then climbed down and fastened 3 bombs together, weighing about 20 pounds. No other man could have hoped to throw so heavy a missile that length, but standing precariously on the shoulders of one of his men, he lit the fuse and hurled the triple grenade right on the roof. The fuse flared and sizzled for a second or two, lighting up the scene for many yards around. And then there was a tremendous roar, and stones and sandbags went flying in all directions. Silence followed, and realizing that the defenders were dead or stunned, we helped each other onto the rocky platform and, crawling over and under the wire entanglements, rushed the entrance passage. From within, we heard groans and a muffled voice. Stop throwing, stop throwing. So we crowded in. Striking matches, we saw that the roof was blown down upon the soldiers. A few were dead, and the rest lay on the ground, stunned. About half were Warwicks, and the rest Hottentot levies. The dead and injured men were removed, also the arms and ammunition, and then we placed the remaining sticks of dynamite in the loopholes, and blew number 4 blockhouse into still further ruin before we returned to Concordia. End quote. What Maurits and company did, what other guerrillas operating in the Cape Colony, Free State, and Transvaal against such steep odds composed a mosaic, a symbol of war resistance.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire. But that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Act the part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
Decoded telegrams decreer also added to this mosaic symbol of Boer resistance. The British War Office broke the code used for Boer telegrams decreer in July 1901. The telegrams betrayed that Botha wanted to make peace, but that Free State President Steyn stood as too strong of an obstacle to the Republic's making peace and giving up their sovereignty. Even before the decoding of these telegrams, Alfred Milner used the stubborn Boer resistance as proof that Kitchener's severe scorched earth policies were not working. Milner also pointed out that Kitchener's policies were too expensive to maintain. Even after a recent income tax increase, the war rapidly exceeded tax revenue. It could only be paid for with loans now. Milner even privately met with the commander-in-chief Lord Roberts to see if there was any way to talk him into immediately sending Kitchener to India, a place Kitchener saw as his next stepping stone. Cabinet sent Kitchener an ultimatum on July 2nd. End the war by September, or adopt Milner's proposed troop drawdown and suspension of scorched earth and a few other items. Kitchener, in turn, used stubborn Boer resistance to argue for staying the course and keeping his 250,000-man army in South Africa at full strength. Kitchener also used the fact that Kurtziner's mini army of around 2,000 men was still operating in the Cape Colony, still trying to cause a greater uprising in the Cape Colony. How could Cabinet reduce Kitchener's army to 140,000 when this invasion force still operated in the Cape Colony? Kitchener went on the rhetorical offensive. He called for mild one-year sentences for Cape rebels who surrendered, death sentences for Cape rebels who didn't surrender, leniency for Boers who surrendered in the Transvaal and Free State, fines and confiscation of property for those Boer Republicans who did not surrender, permanent ejection from Southern Africa for any Boer leaders, deporting wives and children of Boer warriors to one of the islands where Boer POWs lived, selling property of remaining Boer rebels to pay for the cost of concentration camps, and being allowed to take a strong line in general to finish this war off. British cabinet blocked or watered down these aggressive ideas of Kitchener and protested Kitchener allowing the brutal use of the stick in places like Dordrecht. General French forced townspeople there to look on while his troops publicly executed Cape rebels. Ultimately, Cabinet rejected Kitchener's aggressive proposals, but did not follow through on reducing troop numbers by 110,000. So they had to go to Parliament to ask for still more money to fight this war that was far more expensive than they had originally projected. But by September 1901, Kurtziner, De Wet, and company's invasions had come to nothing, at least nothing decisive where the war was concerned. De Wet did succeed at evading British hunts time and time again, which really frustrated Kitchener because De Wet, more than any other Boer leader, stood as the strongest obstacle to Botha and the rest of the Boers surrendering to British might. But De Wet and company could not achieve the Cape Afrikaner uprising they hoped for. They continued to fight and flee, as hundreds and hundreds of Boer warriors left the field, in British hands or on their own volition. None of these failed invasion attempts stopped Jan Smuts and his mere 200 Boer warriors from making their way across the Orange Free State and eventually for the Cape Colony. While Smuts and company made their way across the Orange Free State, Nothing looked encouraging. Smuts wrote the following in his diary on August 7th, 1901. Quote, "Dams everywhere full of rotting animals, water undrinkable, felt covered with slaughtered herds of sheep and goats, cattle and horses. The horror passes description. Surely such outrages on man and nature will lead to certain doom." End quote. Paul Creer's State Secretary's 18-year-old son, Deneys Reitz, traveled with Smuts. Deneys and his brothers refused to stay demoralized in the Transvaal. Deneys traveled with Cus de la Rey's forces, and now with Smuts's small force. Reitz wore no shirt under his ragged coat. His sandals patched multiple times. Reitz wasn't unique. Most of Smuts's commando wore khaki uniforms captured from British soldiers. Some wielded British Lee Medford rifles. This wasn't typically a ruse. This was desperation, their own clothes and equipment exhausted. Reitz didn't know exactly why this Smuts commando was journeying into the Cape Colony. Smuts intentionally made that a mystery to the men who followed. But Smuts didn't overpromise Deneys about what he would face. Smuts promised privations and that their graves would be remembered for generations to come. Back in June, Smuts proposed this reopening of a third front to the War Council at Standerton. Smuts argued that De Wet and Kurtzinner and Hertzog had failed because their Cape incursions were uncoordinated. Smuts proposed joining forces with Kurtzinner and uniting the Free State commandos who remained cut off in the Eastern Cape. Together, they could push to the Western Cape and blaze the trail for a large-scale invasion by De la Rey's remaining Transvaal Boer warriors. But even before they opened up a path for the De la Rey attack, Smuts argued that he and Kurtzinner's force would take pressure off of Botha's forces in the Transvaal and De Wet's forces in the Free State. Smuts also was aware that in mid-1901, outrage in England was growing over the concentration camps. Smuts probably hoped that just holding on a little longer could keep open the possibility of liberals taking power in Britain and maybe bringing about a peace similar to the peace delivered after the First Boer War. Smuts and his now 250 men crossed into the Cape on December 4th. What happened that evening into the ensuing morning appeared a bad omen. Commandant Johannes Lotter's commando had already crossed back into the Cape Colony in May and reunited with Kurtzinner. Commandant Lotter's men scored many small successes while operating in the Eastern Cape, until they ran into a British officer who you could say outbored them. Colonel Harry Scobell's column moved with a speed unparalleled by other British columns. They copied war guerrillas by scrapping wagons in favor of pack mules for greater mobility. Scobell's column packed light. We are talking 3 days' food for a 6-day journey in this case. Not only could Scobell's men and mules move fast, they could move with agility that allowed them to scale mountainsides like goats. After 5 days of this particular war hunt, Colonel Scobell ordered a night march on empty stomachs. Scobell's African scouts far outperformed the 26-year-old Lotter's scouts. Through the heavy rain, they detected Commandant Lotter's commando in the distance. Colonel Scobell outnumbered Lotter's 130-man commando by almost 10-1. But Colonel Scobell refused to take victory for granted. He said to himself, quote, "These rebels know they are fighting with a rope round their necks, and it makes them fight very well." Scobell stayed alert for good reason. Instead of sleeping in a farmhouse in a mountain gorge called Groenkloof, as Scobell initially expected, Lotter and company lay asleep in a 30-foot by 15-foot stone sheep house a few hundred yards away. Before sunrise, Scobell sent some of his 1,000 men to hold ridges looking down on the farm, and then sent others down to the sheep house. Lord Douglas Compton led a squadron of 9th Lancers to the sheep house. The first move must have felt ominous. Right at the doorway of the sheep house, right at the doorway, Lord Compton clumsily dropped his revolver on the ground and then got off his horse to pick up the gun. This is something I can easily imagine my sleep-deprived self doing in a training exercise at Army Basic Training back at Fort Jackson. Anyway, Pakenham writes, quote, 100 sleeping Boers curled up in blankets like so many exhausted sheep in the kraal. This was indeed one of the strangest sights of the war. Lord Douglas did not have long to enjoy it. From sheep to lions. The rifles were cocked, and a fusillade cut down the 6 behind Lord Douglas. He grabbed his revolver and galloped past the doorway. Other survivors fired and scattered. Meanwhile, a tempest of bullets burst over the kraal. It came from all the surrounding ridges, as well as from point-blank range, smashing and grinding the stones and wood and bone and flesh, as though the bullets were explosive themselves. Half an hour of frenzy. Trooper Edinburgh was one of the first to enter the kraal. 70 years later, he remembered that morning with pride. At the time, he was appalled. Someone had tried to wave a white flag, but, as there was still some resistance, the butchery had continued. Edinburgh entered, quote, 8 were lying dead, huddled under the wall. Men were lying about with half their faces shot away, blood spouting out of their chests, thighs, etc. In fact, the place was like a butcher's shop, some men making awful noises, groaning, clutching the ground, and rolling in the dirt in their agony. It was awful. We buried the dead. End quote. So in the aftermath of Scobell's surprise attack, 13 Boers lay dead, 46 wounded, while Lothar and 60 others fell into captivity. Just like that, before Smuts' commando had really done anything in the Cape Colony, more than 10% of Boer guerrillas operating in the Cape got gobbled up. Smuts and company also met plenty of peril. Whether it was fighting Basotho tribesmen, marching for 4 days straight, and still being surrounded by General French's force from September 19th to September 13th. Smuts and company only escaped after a hunchback on crutches showed them a steep, narrow mountain path that took them in earshot of a British camp. Somehow, 250 Boers and their 500 horses quietly escaped French's noose, thanks to the hunchback. But Smuts was losing men and horses and his men's confidence by the day. No Cape Afrikaners joined them. Would this invasion fail in just 2 weeks? If Kitchener and company had already confiscated or burned crops and livestock, how could Smuts and company survive? Maybe you guessed it. Smuts and company would have to pillage the British. A farmer sprinted from his cottage on September 17th and yelled hoarsely to the Smuts commando. 200 British sat circled up nearby with mountain guns, a Maxim, ammunition, horses, and food. Deneys Reitz overheard Smuts say, quote, "If we don't get those horses and supply of ammunition, we're done for." The clash that came at Eland's River came as close to a massacre as anything that South African spring. Many of Smuts' men fired their rifles now with 2 years of battle-hardened experience. Captain Sandeman and Lord Vivian led 130 Brits with skull and crossbones blazoned on their uniforms, with very little battlefield experience. Their patrol saw through the fog what they thought were irregulars from Colonel Gorringe's column. As these irregulars grew closer, a British officer shouted, "Don't fire! We are 17th Lancers." The irregulars replied with a deadly volley. What actually crept up on this British patrol were more than a few Boers wearing British khaki uniforms. Pakenham describes what followed. Quote, Deneys himself used up his last 2 rounds, then threw away his rifle and grabbed a Lee Medford and bandolier from one of the first British soldiers to fall. Reitz shot 2 gunners dead, having crawled up to within a few yards of the main British encampment under the lee of a rocky outcrop. A desperate duel followed, almost at handshake distance, as Reitz put it. 1 wounded officer, it was Lieutenant Sheridan, a cousin of Churchill's, rose to his feet, his face streaming blood, and was shot through the brain. Reitz shot another man in the heel. The shock made him leap in the air, and Jack Boreas brought him down. In all, Reitz's party claimed to have killed 12 or 13 without loss to themselves, though earlier 3 of their men were wounded. Meanwhile, the main commando had worked up to the British camp from the rear. Many Boers here, too, were dressed in captured khaki, and this meant they were allowed to approach to within a few hundred yards, a crucial advantage. When the confused butchery was over, 29 killed and 41 wounded on the British side, compared to 1 dead and 6 wounded among the Boers, the victors took stock of their captures. And well stocked the camp was. "We were like giants refreshed," wrote Reitz later. "We had ridden into action that morning at our last gasp, and we emerged refitted from head to heel. We all had fresh horses, fresh rifles, clothing, saddlery, boots, and more ammunition than we could carry away, as well as supplies for every man." End quote. After the Battle of Eland's River, the British knew, even more than before, that they had to take Smuts seriously. Major Douglas Haig and Smuts faced off for the next month in guerrilla warfare. Yes, that is the same Douglas Haig who rose to the rank of field marshal during the First World War, and who earned criticism for unimaginative and costly frontal attacks he ordered his soldiers to make along the Somme, for example. However, against Smuts, Haig proved an equal match in the guerrilla warfare that followed, at least according to Pakenham. Regardless, Smuts kindled a flame, however small, in the Cape Midlands, a flame of rebellion that did draw some young Cape Afrikaners to take up the armed struggle, belatedly or not. On that same September 17th, Louis Botha fought a battle many miles away. The other half of Smuts's Standerton proposal back in June hinged on an invasion of Natal. This, in theory, would divert pressure away from the Boer republics. Louis Botha's force stood nearly 1,000 horsemen strong, but couldn't Kitchener just send 20,000 men to counter this invasion too? Botha was about to find out. Botha also kept quiet on grand strategy as he led his men to where he had helped humiliate the British at Colenso and Spion Kop, to where he had fought with one Zulu army against another years before. Botha's force traveled light, intentionally forsaking any field guns that could slow them down. Torrential rain ruined Botha's original plan to attack the British camp at Dundee. So Botha drove his army towards Zululand and towards the vicinity of Major Hubert Gough's mounted infantry. Major Gough endeared himself to Lord Kitchener as one of the few cavalry officers with sufficient aggression. With this aggression came frustration. Major Gough resented the lack of aggression and fortitude shown by many other commanders, saying, quote, "They move about in solemn masses down the main roads, expecting and usually fearing a battle, which the Boers would not and could not fight." Gough also grew frustrated with seemingly aimless searching for Boers. Gough grew more frustrated at some Irish companies of his battalion after a 500-mile train ride to Natal. One company got drunk before boarding their railway cars in Kruenstadt. Another company got wasted while detraining in Dundee. Gough wished he could flog his men the way Boer commandants could. So he marched his men in the rain to De Jager's Drift, where British intelligence reported an impending attack by Botha's force. British intelligence often exaggerated in their reports, so Gough wasn't all that optimistic that he would run into any real threat. This time, Gough was wrong. Riding forward with 3 companies, he caught sight of 200 to 300 Boers riding northwards from Skeeper's Neck. Gough watched these Boers dismount at a farm near Blood River Port. Gough requested backup, 450 mounted infantry that Lieutenant Colonel Stewart was holding in reserve. Gough called for a surprise attack. Finally, Goff prepared for a battle he'd been itching to fight. Meanwhile, about 2 hours after Smuts led an attack at Eland's River, Botha had a decision to make. He could wait to be outnumbered 10 or 15 to 1 again once more Kitchener reinforcements arrived, or strike Goff's force while it was outnumbered. What Goff couldn't see was Botha's main force of 700. These 700 rode hard to hit Goff's unsuspecting right flank holding a ridge at that point. Goff watched in horror and disbelief as Botha's force cut down this British company in 20 minutes. Goff rode frantically across to his 2 field guns, only to find his men frantically failing to find a clear target as Botha's Boers swarmed. Pakenham picks up here, quote, "Some Boers galloped up, pointed their guns at the gunners, and shouted, 'Hands up!' Goff put his hand down to his holster. It was empty. His orderly had forgotten to put in his revolver that morning. 'Shoot them! Shoot them!' Goff shouted, with the impotence of a man in a nightmare. Lieutenant Price Davies drew his revolver but was shot in the shoulder at point-blank range. Goff threw himself off his horse and tried to use it as a shield, but Botha's men had overrun them completely. The nightmare of humiliation passed soon into farce. Goff stripped off his helmet, field glasses, coat, riding boots, and gaiters, played hide-and-seek with his captors under cover of darkness. He grabbed someone else's boots, 5 sizes too large, and with only a shred of a bootlace." End quote. It gets worse for Goff before it gets better. Goff desperately hid in a giant ant-hole, only to be dragged out by the Boers. But when the night grew dark, he escaped with blistered feet to a nearby British patrol. The telegraph lines hummed the next day with the embarrassing stats: 20 Brits dead, 24 wounded, and 241 Brits captured. September 17th went down as the most humiliating day for the British since Clement got crushed at Neugendacht 9 months earlier. Botha's force captured 180 rifles, 30,000 rounds of ammunition, 200 horses, 2 field guns, and over 200 Brits, but this victory felt hollow in a way. The field guns were useless to Botha. Goff's mounted men had already almost ridden the 200 horses to death, and all Botha could do with the British captives is strip them and send them walking away, to eventually be reclothed and re-equipped by whatever British force they ran into. Botha's men still hadn't found a way to drive deep into Natal like they'd hoped. At least, not a way not already blocked by British forces. Then Botha blundered. He tried to strike Fort Itala and Fort Prospect, British camps along the Zulu frontier. Local burghers said these camps would be easy targets because they lacked trenches. This time, Botha, not the British, relied on what proved to be terrible intelligence. Both Itala and Prospect sat surrounded by strong trench systems. Botha's Boers threw themselves at these camps and suffered about 100 precious casualties and achieved nothing. Then, they all had to flee back into the Transvaal when 15,000 more Brits flooded the region. So what came of Smuts' plan to invade Natal and the Cape Colony simultaneously? Smuts argued that more than farm burning, keeping fresh horses out of Boer hands really crippled the guerrillas. By the standards Smuts set for these invasions, the joint invasions completely failed to meet their goals. No road lay open for De la Rey to lead a larger invasion of the Cape Colony. Natal looked impervious, and very few new Afrikaners in the Cape joined the rebellion. And who could blame them? The Boer resistance looked too small to achieve anything but pinpricks against the 250,000 Brits occupying southern Africa. Kitchener's tactics, however cruel or crude, had whittled the Boer forces down to about 25,000, about half of the number of rebels in the field when Lord Roberts left for Britain. That's it for this episode. We only got a couple more remaining. Still time, though, for you to keep sending me questions that you have about these wars, about what we've covered these last 42 episodes now, and that will increase the odds that I produce a question and answer episode. It would mean a lot to me if you would rate the show, especially on Apple Podcasts, and if you would leave a written review as well, and if you would share the podcast on anywhere that you use social media, or even via email, if that's how you roll. Take care, everyone.